Next, the dog, Hin. How can a dog be a wizard? When Miyazaki wrote the proposal of this film, he described this character as a human dog. Madame Suleiman tells this dog to serve her for the rest of his life as her spy. I don't know if this is supposed to be a punishment, but at the end, when Hin laughs at Suleiman's blunder, she says, "You unfaithful two-timer!" Suleiman uses the word unfaithful instead of the word traitor, which means that Suleiman basically considers all of her servants as her lovers. She treats her lovers like puppets, makes them fall in love with her, and exploits them. That's my personal opinion. So you can always sense this dark emotion in every scene. So why did he call it a human dog? There's a scene where Sophie climbs up the stairs with Hin, and he's extremely heavy. He's a lot heavier than she thought. That's because he's still a human, although he looks like a dog. That's why Sophie says, "Why are you so heavy?" and lifts him up with all her strength. Miyazaki made this scene to reveal this secret. Instead of saying, "You're heavy," she says, "Why are you so heavy?" You can see the cruel side of Suleiman here. She turned a human into a dog to serve her for decades. Hin shows the cruel side of Suleiman, but you can also see the double structure here. It's typical of a woman's cruelty. But at the same time, kids love dogs. So Miyazaki knows exactly what he's doing. Madame Suleiman. Needless to say, Madame Suleiman is a witch. She's the principal of Royal Magic Academy, and she's merciless. She's like Musca in Raputa, Castle in the Sky. The page boys of Madame Suleiman, well, those boys that look just like the young Howl, the servants around her, and the butlers, they're all dressed like the young Howl. You can see the erotic relationship between Suleiman and Howl. It's kind of messy in a way, and you should take notice. And it's not that Miyazaki was careless and made everyone look the same. He's saying there's something you might want to look into. Lastly, Sophie. Not many people realize that Sophie is also a witch. As you know, I was really surprised. Miyazaki explains it with his drawing. This is the last scene. From the very first scene, when Sophie goes out, she always wears a straw hat, and there's a red ribbon on it. She always wears a red shawl too. It's a sign that she's always a young girl, even when she's old. But in the last scene, the ribbon suddenly turns black. Miyazaki has used black as a symbol of a witch since Kiki's Delivery Service. Miyazaki shows this clearly by drawing a black ribbon so that he doesn't have to explain. This is actually the proof. So there are 9 different witches or wizards all together, including Sophie. So keep that in mind. How could I know? Yes, people don't realize it. Miyazaki's films are so complex. It's all calculated. That's why they're so interesting. Now, it's already 30 minutes, but I'll continue. I'm going to explain the story and the plot. I'll explain the difference. The story is usually the scenes laid out in order like the storyboard. They're in the right order. whereas the plot is laid out based on cause and effect. So for the plot, the scenes are laid out according to a timeline, and the story focuses on how to present this. In Dragon Ball, Son Goku, raised by an old man in the countryside, meets Bulma, and they set out on a journey together. This is the story. The plot goes like this. A long time ago, there was a lost child of Ryu tribe on planet Namek. The good part of him became a god, and the bad part of him became the evil king Piccolo. Frieza, who dominates the universe, conquers the Saiyans. The Saiyans send Kakarot, who later becomes Son Goku. Plot is laid out based on time. The incident that happened before is always what triggers the next incident. So you can see the cause and effect. Story is more about how you present it. The rhythm of the story changes in the middle. There's part A, B, and C in this film, but usually Miyazaki's films end at part B. As you can see, there's 2 lines in part A, 3 lines in part B, 4 lines in part C. It goes on to part D and part E and goes on and on. At the end, the words can't fit in anymore. The number of words grow towards the end. This is because when Miyazaki was making the storyboard, he realized that the individual cuts in part A were too long. They were 10 seconds each. When Suzuki asked him about this, he said, "Damn, Sophie is so old and slow. I became slow as well." He couldn't change that anymore. So each cut is very long in part A and part B. But as you reach the second half, it gets much faster. That's because they were trying to get back to 6 seconds per cut. Each cut becomes shorter and shorter as you go along. So it speeds up. In part A, Sophie falls in love with Howl at first sight. She is turned into an old lady by the spell of the Witch of the Waste. In part B, she starts working as a cleaning lady at Howl's castle. Howl is summoned by the king. Howl is disappointed by the color of his hair. In part C, Howl is scared of both Suleiman and the Witch of the Waste, and he sends Sophie instead. When Sophie arrives at the palace, the Witch of the Waste turns into an old lady. Howl runs away from a magic fight. Sophie takes the dog and the old lady home. These are part A, B, and C, half of the story. Like I said, this story is told from Sophie's point of view. This is hard to see because Miyazaki at some point decided to cut all the scenes that have nothing to do with Sophie's romance. When you look at it closely, it's all there. But, for example, in the TV series Sanadamaru, all the scenes of Lord Nobunaga Oda's prime were cut out from the story. Those scenes were cut just because the protagonist, Nobushige Sanada, wasn't in them. Instead, the story covers the era of Nobunaga and the following years up to the summer siege of Osaka from Nobushige's point of view as he grows up to become a warlord. So if you don't have the basic knowledge of this period, it's hard to understand. And the suicide of Nobunaga is only described by the narrator. But in Howl's Moving Castle, there is not even a narration. For example, if the story is told only from Nobushige's girlfriend, Kiri's point of view, and just added some narration to it, everything would seem so abrupt. The viewers would lose track of history, and everything would become oversimplified. That's what's happening here. Now, This is very important. Take a look at this. This is the plot of Howl's Moving Castle. It's not told in the film, but here it is. This plot will allow you to understand more about this film. It's pretty long, but I'll read from the top. Let's look at the plot of Howl's Moving Castle according to the timeline. You can take screenshots if you want. The neighboring country is a kingdom founded by witches, a magic kingdom. Because the prince is a wizard, they have state-of-the-art magic. Sophie's country competed with them using science, like Marley in Attack on Titans. Howl's uncle tries to finish writing a magic scroll, but dies. This is important. This means that when Sophie travels back in time to Howl's childhood, you see a paperweight here, and the paperweights are shaped like gun batteries and all the other things Howl loves. At first, I thought it was Howl's paperweight, but that doesn't make sense because back at that time, he's only like 10 years old, but it says unfinished draft on the desk. The draft means a manuscript that is set to be published, but that has not been published yet. So that means that this belonged to his deceased uncle. This scene is at the end of part E. This wizard uncle died before he was able to publish his book. It has not been published yet, so it's a draft. Before he could finish the book, he was probably killed by someone from the neighboring country to stop him from publishing magic. If magic was published, this magic kingdom would lose their superiority over the other country. That's when the relationship between the two countries worsens. You've got to understand this point. Otherwise, you won't understand who the enemy is. It's hard to know whose side Howl is on. Is he on Suleiman's side or the neighboring country's side? He's attacking almost everybody. That's because he hates the magic kingdom that killed his uncle, and he also hates Suleiman, who tries to control him. So everybody is the enemy. So first, you must know that Howl's uncle died before he could finish writing his magic scroll. Otherwise, you'd be lost. So Howl doesn't like the magic kingdom. The king of Howl's country, who never appears, saw the neighboring country as a threat and ordered Suleiman to establish the magic academy where Howl studies. Next, the night when the stars fall. The night he makes a contract with the falling star. It's important to remember that Sophie named the star Calcifer. So, when the star falls and they make an agreement to share their hearts, Sophie says, "Howl, Calcifer," so that the two can hear. She says, "I'm Sophie. I'll see you in the future." Calcifer has already made a contract, so Calcifer hears this too. So there's a cut where Calcifer and Howl look at Sophie. So at that point, Sophie is also included in that contract. That's why he was named Calcifer. And it's depicted quite carefully. You wouldn't understand this if you don't look at it in order. Then, Howl runs away from Suleiman. Suleiman is shocked. You'll see this later, but Howl leaves Suleiman because he has made a contract with Calcifer and gained power. That's how he escapes the academy. Of course, Suleiman tries to stop him, but there is a scene that explains why Suleiman is in the wheelchair later on. When you look at the feud between the two later on, you can see that Suleiman was extremely heartbroken. It's easier for you to understand the story when you look at it this way. This Madame Suleiman is also a complex character. When she says to Sophie, "How cannot stay that way? He's problematic," she hides her face with her stick as she talks. A villain must always hide her face. When Suleiman does evil things, she always uses her stick to block the sight of human beings. She might be using some magic to affect Sophie, but above all else, she just looks so cruel. Suleiman is in a wheelchair after the first combat with Howl. 50 years before, a female student ran away from Suleiman and became the Witch of the Waste. Suleiman creates page boys and turns a man into a dog. So the country begins to put more effort into science research on magic. Next, Howl seduces a witch. He seduces the Witch of the Waste just for fun and then runs away. He repeats this behavior with many girls. Suleiman attacks a prince and turns him into a scarecrow. I call this the Sarajevo incident because basically this story is about World War I. As the assassination of the Prince of Austria led to war, this war in the story is led by Suleiman herself. I guess the prince in the neighboring country was pretty strong. I guess this was one of her operations to neutralize magic by curse. World War I begins. Suleiman tries to take Howl's magic power away from him. When Howl fights, Miyazaki shows the military power of the two nations. You can actually see the soldiers trench fighting. So you can see the nightmarish battle between the two countries that doesn't seem to end. Howl meets Sophie, guided by the ring. It's hard to recognize it, but this is where Howl and Sophie met for the first time. When Sophie is trying to get away from the soldier, Howl says, "Sorry, have you been waiting long?" And you can see the ring flashing red when he wraps his hand around her shoulder. His ring flashes red or blue only when they are calling to each other. So this is her destiny. Long, long ago, he met a girl who said, "I'm Sophie and I'll come and see you again." But he doesn't realize that he finally meets her. He's just picking up a girl as usual. But the ring knows Miyazaki is trying to alert the viewers. So Howl isn't aware of his own destiny. This is Miyazaki's way of depicting romance, and it's puzzling. A comment just said that it's hard to tell. As you can see in the storyboard, it only says the ring flashes red. I was about to overlook this, but I thought something was wrong. I eventually found out about this rule that the ring only flashes when they are calling to each other. Now, finally we have reached the main story. After the whole story of Howl's moving castle is over, the prince goes back to his own country and Suleiman agrees to surrender. Suleiman says with some dignity, "Oh, what can you do? I'll end this stupid war." She looks calm on the surface, but she's the female version of Muska. Although she looks like a plain old lady, she's Muska inside. So it's the instrument of surrender. Her country is totally burned. In the opening scene, the people are cheering the warship, saying, "Go and win!" But only one warship returns, and it's about to sink. It's just like Japan at the very end of World War II, the summer of 1945. That's why she signed the instrument of surrender. The nation is bankrupt because of the massive reparations. Howl went up in the sky because he could no longer do business in his country. It's just like Germany post-World War I. And after a few decades, Suleiman starts another war, World War II. The last scene where after she says, "What can you do? I'll end this war." You see the airplanes, and you also see Howl's castle in the air. You may think that the plane is coming home from the war, but when you look down, it's all green below. It can't be green because the whole country was burnt. It's impossible to have farms there. So that means this scene is 10 or 20 years later. Just like Germany, the country that was severely defeated in World War I, bounces back and invades the surrounding countries. History repeats itself. And in 2005, Suzuki talks about this in an interview published in Saizo magazine. It is the January issue of Saizo. Suzuki is asked by the interviewer, "Isn't it too soon to end the war like that? Don't you think it's too simple?" It's unusual for Suzuki, but he gets really angry and answers the question with a raised voice. He says, "Didn't you see the planes flying in the last cut? That means another war is beginning. Those planes aren't coming back from the war. They are preparing for war." It's very unusual for him. He explains clearly what the scene meant. Suleiman signs the instrument of surrender, and the war ends. But it starts again some decades later. It's hard to know because both Howl and Sophie seem like they haven't aged. So we tend to think that this happened right after. Howl is a wizard, so he can change his appearance freely, but Sophie is also a witch. Because Sophie is a witch, she can stay young forever, but in reality, it's after a few decades. When you look at the whole picture, you'll notice that this story is part of an epic. You're looking at this epic story solely from Sophie's point of view. So, it's very experimental in a way. A comment said, "It's hard to tell." Yes, I agree with you. Well, Miyazaki clearly went a bit too far. Honestly, the story lost its balance. They overestimated the viewers. You know, in Spirited Away, many people pointed out the inconsistency. They were more intuitive when they made Spirited Away, but because they didn't like being criticized, the plan was well thought out this time. But they tried not to show it. Although it's all meticulously planned, Miyazaki didn't explain it at all. He was like, "You don't need to explain about World War II to tell a love story set in World War II." He was like, "It's no problem as long as it's cool." But I think he needs to explain a bit more. Why not explain it after all this planning? Last, Sophie and Howl live happily ever after in the flying castle without aging. The black ribbon proves that she has become a witch. The flying castle in the last scene is the opposite of Laputa. Miyazaki once said that you must go back to the land. But 20 years later he says it's okay to live in the sky. It's about freeing oneself from gravity. So, because gravity makes you old, Growing old means aging. When you get old, your body gets heavier and you lose magic power. The Witch of the Waste cannot climb the stairs anymore. The gravity and the aging go hand in hand. You become heavier as you age. Why does this castle fly? Because Miyazaki tried to depict an ultimate happy ending where Howl and Sophie live together in the sky, free from aging. And you cannot miss the scene where they capture the castle from above. You'll notice something strange. The old lady reading a book, Hin and Marco. Everything looks completely natural, except for this flag. There's an apple tree drawn on it. Well, a tree that looks like an apple tree. And there's quite a deep meaning to it. I thought about it and I figured out pretty soon that this is a pun. Ringoku means neighboring country. And Ringo means apple. The prince in the neighboring country who said, "I'll eventually come back," lives in this room. Sophie welcomes everyone she likes into her own family. It's a family, so she could have had her own sister or her mother. But instead, she welcomes the people she likes, or the people she has kissed, into her own family. She's in the midst of happiness, where the time has stopped. This is the ultimate happiness for girls. That's the message. And he makes it very subtle. If you show the prince of the neighboring country, it just becomes too graphic. So he shows the flag instead. So I'll end the explanation of the whole structure and plot. Now, this is the end of the first half. We'll talk about this in the second half. But this story is about Howl being controlled by three witches: Suleiman, Witch of the Waste, and Sophie. I'll explain how Howl was influenced by these three witches. Like I said, this is a story about what happens if Clarice goes on to live with Lupin. It's also similar to Madoka Magica. I'll talk about that. This is the end of the free part. Let's see the result. I had so much information to share with you, and I'm sorry that I had to talk so fast. I assume that you have already seen the film, so that's why, it's always the same, but everybody only sees the surface of the story. Sometimes it's better that way, but you can stumble at certain points because it doesn't make sense. Now the result. Thank you. The second half will be scarier. Next week, on August 19th, we'll discuss Osamu Hayashi's theory that you don't need friends. And we welcome any questions, so please submit your questions. On August 26th, we'll discuss My Neighbor Totoro. On September 2nd, we'll talk about rockets. Well, take a look at the life of Von Braun. On September 9th, we'll talk about the book Homo Deus, which will be released soon. And I think it's going to be a huge hit. Our goal is to provide a lecture more worthy than what you pay. I'm going to San Francisco tomorrow, and I go to a place called Disney Family Museum. At the end of the 1980s, the Disney family was kicked out of the company so that Disney wouldn't go bankrupt. So they were angry and took all the relics of Walt Disney and Roy Disney and made this family museum near the bay in San Francisco. And it's pretty deep. I'm going there for work, so I'll tell you about it soon. Let's switch.
Thank you for watching until the end. I am the most famous otaku king in Japan, Otaku King Toshio Okada. I started planning to talk overseas about animations and movies popular in Japan in English. Before long, I'm planning to add English subtitles to movie talking in Japanese, so please look forward to it. If you ask a question in this comment field of this video, maybe I will talk about comments as a theme. We welcome the people who are interested in the forefront of Japanese otaku culture, and those who want to hear stories of interesting animations and movies. So please subscribe our channel. If there is good relation, I will get better and I will do my best. Thanks.